Okay, Councillor Corthorne, you can begin when you're ready.
Thank you, and a very warm welcome to a meeting of the virtual Social Care, Housing and Public Health Policy and Overview Committee. This virtual meeting is also being broadcast simultaneously on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon, London. I'm Councillor Philip Corthorne and I am Chairman of this meeting. Now, before we start, some important online housekeeping for everyone present. First of all, please make sure any mobile phones around you are on silent. If you are wearing a headset, please ensure your microphone is away from your mouth to avoid noise when you're speaking. When you're not speaking. Please keep your microphone muted when not speaking and then unmute to speak. Only one person may speak at a time, and I, as chairman, will call those to speak. And now, before we move on to the agenda, I'd like to do a roll call of the councillors present to confirm attendance. So please indicate you're present when I say your name. Councillor McQuarrie.
Good evening, I'm present.
Good evening. Councillor Cooper.
Good evening, I'm present.
Good evening. Councillor DeVille.
Good evening, I'm present.
Good evening. Councillor Eggington.
Good evening, Chair, I'm present.
Good evening. Councillor Gardner.
Good evening, I'm present.
Good evening to you. Councillor Hagar.
Good evening, I'm present.
Good evening. Councillor Rodriguez.
Good evening, I'm present.
Good evening. And finally, Councillor Tuckwell.
Good evening, everybody. I am present.
Good evening. And also, please can officers present indicate they're in the meeting. So, David Haygarth, please.
Present, Chair. Thank you.
Evening, David. And Steve Clark.
Present, Chairman.
And I note Dan Kennedy's present. Did you want to register, Dan?
Yes, please. Thank you, Chairman.
And I'm not sure from my phone here whether any other officers are present, but in the absence of any notification, we'll move on. So thank you. Thank you for that. So moving on then, in terms of technical meeting control, if any councillor leaves the virtual meeting partway through for a period of time, for example, the lost connection, I will continue the meeting unless we are not quorate, which for these purposes is 3 councillors. And with that, I will move then to the agenda items. So the first of those is apologies for absence. Now, no apologies received, as far as I'm aware, so I'll move on unless anyone has got any other information to the contrary. No, I don't think so. So no apologies for absence. Steve? Yep.
No apologies received, Chairman.
Declarations of interest in matters before this meeting. Are there any matters of interest to declare? No. Okay, lovely. Noted. And then to receive and agree the minutes of the last meeting. So there are two meetings involved there, the 14th of January 2021 and the 19th of January 2021. Can I take it that they're received and agreed? Okay, I'm getting no indications to the contrary. I will just say, if I may, that I'm using my phone, so I'm hoping it's clear when people are indicating. Please shout otherwise, because I don't want to miss anyone. So I think just going back to that, the minutes of the 14th of Jan and the 19th of Jan, I'm taking those as received and agreed.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I just say, just while we're on that, just make one point. The autism recommendations that we spoke about last time, because of the relatively short turnaround time for this meeting, we've got we're taking those at the March meeting because we're only 3 weeks from our last meeting, so it gives us a bit more time, but they will be coming back to us. Okay, and then point 4 on the list to confirm public and private reports, and all items this evening are to be held in part 1. Okay, so we move on to part 1 of the agenda, which the first item of which is the housing briefing. This is the update on housing stock and the zero carbon commitment. So we're going to be hearing now from David Haygarth, who is the council's new climate action manager, who will be giving a presentation and verbal report. So at that point, I'll hand over to you, if I may, David, and then I'm sure we'll have some questions for you.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Just allow me a moment, if I may, just to try and share this presentation with you. Thank you. Could I just confirm you're seeing that?
I can see it. I can see it perfectly well.
Yep.
Everyone else
okay.
happy?
Okay.
Okay, lovely.
Just okay, so thank you all very much for inviting me along tonight to provide this update. I do hope it gives you the overview that you're looking for. The format of this agenda item number 5 for housing and the zero carbon commitment. We've got a verbal update with slides. I'm hoping to keep it under 10 minutes for you. Our focus is housing energy. As the councillor mentioned, my name is David Haygarth. I am in the post of Climate Action Manager, and the role sits within Dan Kennedy's directorate, working across all departments. I've set some objectives for this evening. I just wish to give a brief overview of the policy environment I'm looking at, make a couple of observations about progress over the previous decade, consider the new climate strategy and some of the objectives that have arisen from the climate declaration that was made in January last year. I want to have a quick look at our areas of influence and control, consider some of the activity to reduce carbon emissions, and also maybe towards the end consider any further requirements that the committee may have in this area as we develop this strand of work. If we look first at the policy environment, some of the key political commitments came as far back as 2007 with the Nottingham Declaration on Climate Change. That led to the development of the climate change strategy in 2009 until 2012. More recently, we've had the climate declaration, as I mentioned a moment ago, in 2020, and that has led to the development of the climate action strategy, which is very much in the early draft stages, but we do have a structure for it, which is being developed. Other key policy drivers in this area over the last 10 years, housing energy efficiency generally has been driven by decent home strategies and affordable warmth, and also in the early part of the sort of 2000s and 2010, the HECA strategies, which are, sorry, HECA being Home Energy Conservation Act, for anyone who's not heard of it. As well as carbon emissions, we have to look at the twinned issue of fuel poverty. I've sourced some stats for us to have a look at there as to where we are in terms of fuel poverty. This is a table which shows the highest performing in the sense that they have the lowest levels of fuel poverty, and the worst performing, let's say, in Newham with the worst levels of fuel poverty. And I've also put in our neighbours of Hounslow, Harrow, Ealing and Brent and their relative positions in the London boroughs. Hillingdon, as you see, has a 10.1% proportion of fuel poor households, which is actually a reduction over where we were in 2010. And these figures have been sourced from central government. And just in case you can't see it there, the figure in 2010 was 11.2%, now down to 10.1%. Moving on, if we have a look at our own carbon emissions from the council operations, we can see some reductions over the last 10, 11 years in terms of gas and electricity, down by 33%. In terms of fleet transport, mainly through vehicle improvements, upgrades and specification, we've had a very substantial reduction of 75% in emissions. And overall, over our 2008-9 baseline of 21,608 tonnes, we've dropped by around 42%. So thinking about the new climate strategy, when I joined the council a few weeks back, one of the first things I did was to have a look at the climate declaration and try and distill what the key messages were coming from it, from the councillors and that council meeting. And working with my colleagues, we've ascertained that these are the objectives that we think are really jumping out at us. And the primary one, objective number 1, is to enable our residents, businesses and schools to reduce their own carbon emissions. And we see that very much as a leadership and influencing role. Our next key objective, which was explicitly stated, was to become carbon neutral across council services by 2030. Our third objective was to achieve 100% clean energy across the council services by 2030. And within each of those, we believe we have to set action plans for each of those objectives. It's important for us to consider where we have control and where we have influence. And in terms of housing emissions, I believe we have levels of influence over freeholders, private sector dwellings where people own their own properties. And we have a level of influence in terms of the support and advice we can provide to private sector rented, private sector landlords, and including the social care settings, sheltered homes, care homes, that kind of thing. We have more direct control over our housing revenue account, our HRA properties, in terms of our landlords' utilities, where we pay for the energy being used on the site, but also in terms of the improvements that we can make to HRA tenanted properties. And we also now have, within the aspects of the London plan, we have a greater degree of control over the design of new build and the aim to achieve zero carbon emissions within new developments by 2030. Now, moving on to objective number 1, we're looking at what we can do for residents and the reductions for their carbon emissions. These are the types of activities that are underway at the moment and where we would seek to influence carbon reduction and fuel poverty. Some of you may be aware of a recent grant that was awarded for HRA properties of around about 3.8 million. And that is predominantly for thermal efficiency works such as insulation and glazing upgrades. And that work is actually underway at the moment, has got underway, and that will be targeting around 2,000 homes. Additionally, the Head of Planned Works has put forward a paper for HRA funded boiler upgrades, where we've identified around 2,000 properties which are have boilers in which are over 15 years old and less efficient than the current standard condensing style boilers. We're also looking at low energy lighting works, and additionally on a more miscellaneous side, more energy efficient lifts and emergency lighting. And also over the years, there's been a number of investments in solar power. So Sibley Court and Trescott House are good examples of where we've invested in solar power. In terms of the freehold and the private sector rented areas, we've always had an influencing role there, which is true for most local authorities, and it's usually involving signposting or raising awareness for grant funding and access to schemes for private sector residents. And colleagues have been working in a West London partnership on a voucher scheme for our private sector residents. And I hope to provide more information on that perhaps at the next update. As mentioned, in terms of new build, we are here to ensure developers meet zero carbon requirements for London plan requirements, and where they cannot necessarily meet zero carbon in entirety on that development, they will be required to make a contribution to an offset fund. In terms of objectives 2 and 3, which is very much focused on council reductions, again, planned works, FM colleagues are very much looking at demand reduction in our civic buildings, in the schools, social care settings, and this is really a mixture of energy demand reduction works, insulation, heating controls, better glazing, but again, investment where possible in renewable power. As mentioned earlier, the fleet colleagues have been working to improve the specification of our vehicles. I think there's over 50 vehicles upgraded last year and 50 this year, where we are moving towards Euro 6 diesel ratings. And where possible, particularly with the private and light goods side, we are upgrading to hybrid and electric vehicles. The other key strand of the council reduction objectives relates to energy from renewable sources. I haven't included that in the previous figures because that we are now, for the first year since those figures were produced, buying from 100% renewable sources for our electrical energy. So that's electrical energy which comes from solar, wind turbines supplied to the grid, and we are purchasing accredited renewable supplies from the grid via our energy supplier. This means that we will still, as we go over the next 10 years, even if we was to procure electrical energy from renewable sources, we would still have a carbon component associated with our space heating and hot water heating. So we try to mitigate that with a range of carbon offsetting and low carbon technologies. And some of the things which we're looking at the moment, again in its infancy, is how we could possibly use our open space assets, our tree planting regimes and schemes to perhaps sequester carbon and bring that into our balance sheet to act as a positive benefit for our carbon zero commitment. And we're also looking at the potential for renewable power projects in areas of open space, providing they accord with all the necessary planning and other consents that we may need. So if I can summarise that, I hope we were able to consider some of the policy drivers and why we are looking at this area. We had a quick look at some of the 10-year progress on emissions and fuel poverty, considered the climate action strategy and some new objectives that are coming through, looked at some of the activities around residence emissions reduction, and then at some of the council emissions reductions, had a quick look at some of the issues around zero carbon scope and carbon offset. And if you have any questions or any requirements for future policy committees, then please let me know, and I'm happy to obviously take that away. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much indeed for that. That was very helpful and most enlightening. It certainly was. Just an observation to make. Obviously, it's worth saying that the whole climate strategy transcends this particular pocket. It's of interest to all of us, no doubt. But I guess we need to try and confine our line of questioning really to the housing side of things, which is what you've been talking to. And of course, the council will be consulting on the strategy in due course. I think. Am I right in saying it comes to cabinet in March?
I've seen it identified as a forward plan item for March. Yes, Chair.
Okay, fine. Well, if I may perhaps start the ball rolling with questions. I mean, just one occurs to me. I was looking at the policy drivers that you highlighted in one of your slides. One I didn't see there, and perhaps I missed it, and it was a future home standard that's being consulted on at the moment. And one of the things I picked up from that was the, I think, proposed banning of fossil fuel fired boilers from 2025. And properties being zero carbon ready by 2025. Am I understanding that correctly? And if I am, I suppose it's how all of what you said really works into those wider objectives, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that to my attention. The future home stand is not something I've come across in this initial review, but it's certainly something I will have a look at. What I can refer to is the zero carbon requirement coming through in the London plan. But that is not as specific as to rule out one form of heating. It's talking about generally reducing the carbon in new developments. But thank you for that. I'll take that away if I may.
Not at all. If we'd have another report in due course with a little more meat on the bone, it'd be useful perhaps to have that update if that's possible.
Yeah.
But we'll come back to that at the end. Councillor Tutwell, I think you're indicating.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, David, for a very informative presentation. I just wanted to pick up a point earlier in your presentation around fuel poverty, and that we've got 10,000 properties that fall into that bracket. I just wondered if you could just outline what the definition of fuel poverty is, so that I can have a better understanding of that.
Yes, Councillor. I mean, the definition I'd always worked to with fuel poverty as a concept is where the fuel bill for a household exceeds 10% of the household disposable income. That was a definition which I always work to, but it's generally taken to be when the energy itself is let's say becoming unaffordable, and residents are having to make decisions around heating or eating, or they're adversely affected by the inefficiency of the heating within their home, and their home is not reaching a suitable level of thermal comfort. So if that's a bit rambling, but we try to capture a lot of things with fuel poverty. And it's intrinsically linked to housing standards and how people are heating their homes, the type of technologies that they're using.
No, okay, no,
Does that
thank
help?
you. No, thank you for sharing that, David. And I've got no follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Egginton. I think you indicated.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, I think I'm aware that their minimum energy efficiency standard, which is related to the EPC ratings for private rented accommodation. Well, of course, it's for all private accommodation. I was just really going to ask whether the council also follows that requirement when it's letting its housing stock. And also, can you tell me, or tell the committee, how many of the properties are within each of the EPC ratings of our housing stock? I realise you probably won't be able to do that at the moment. It's probably not something which you've got on the top immediately to hand, but it would be very helpful so that we can see what size the problem is in terms of the amount of work and expense needed. In particular, I noticed, and it was in the minutes, you probably didn't see the minutes of the last meeting, but in that, one of your fellow officers indicated that the big problem with regard to managing voids is the lack of investment in social housing by Hillingdon over the last, well, I don't know how many years, it wasn't indicated, but certainly there has been a lack of investment, and that was minuted in those. And I wondered whether that can be remedied by the work which is necessary on insulation and new boilers. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Councillor. I think the way I look at that is from my initial review of the documentation, so from the grant applications that I saw go forward to secure this 3.8 million, it was clear to me that the funding was awarded on the basis of properties that needed targeting on the basis of their EPC rating, which I believe was an E, F and G, and the funding has been awarded to target those specific properties. I think it was around 2,000 of them that needed cavity wall works, glazing work, or other types of insulation work to help lift them into a higher category. Now, if you couple that with the planned boiler replacements, which our head of FM and planned and reactive works has put forward, I believe, elsewhere, we're also targeting, subject to approval, a wider range of boiler upgrades, which will no doubt hit some of those properties as well. So I can't speak to any former underinvestment because I simply wasn't here and I haven't reviewed any papers to that effect. But what I can say is that from what I've seen going forward certainly over the next quarter and the next 6 months, there seems to be a very clear intent to get work done to lift the SAP rating of the HRA stock. When we think about voids, again, I probably need to take that away and speak to colleagues, but my understanding is that when a property is void, that is an ideal time to make improvements to help lift that SAP rating again. Now, whether you can do everything to that property at that point in time is another question, but it's usually taken as a good time to make good and make improvements before it is re-let. That concludes what I've got to say on that, Councillor, unless you have any further.
I mean,
requirement.
Sorry, go on, Tony.
Yeah, very, very briefly, quite a lot of the blocks, at least in the ward which I represent, a lot of the properties are in blocks, and inevitably it's very difficult to just deal with a property where there's a void between tenancies. It really needs to be a longer term approach to it, which obviously some tenants will be inconvenienced, but nevertheless, I think it's the only way really to do it on a comprehensive basis.
Yeah, may I come back on that, Chairman?
Indeed. Please, David. Yes, please.
Thank you. What I would say there, Councillor, is that where properties are in blocks, my experience has been that we usually try, or local authorities more specifically, usually try and make their improvements to insulation, let's say external wall insulation, solid wall insulation, or roofing insulation upgrades at a point where they have the access equipment in place. So if, for example, a roofing replacement was being done, then insulation would be upgraded at that point in time, and potentially glazing and solid wall work may also be done. And that is the kind of opportunity that I would be working with maintenance colleagues to try and address, to make sure if we hit a block, for example, we try and hit it with everything that is required to be done to improve the building fabric. That's a sort of a kind of a standard approach, I would say, that we would want to see used if it's not being used already. Thank you.
Okay, and just one further one for B, David, as well, if I may. I'm just hearing all you say, and there's some tremendous stuff going on clearly, but this is no small undertaking. And certainly it will take some resource, there's no doubt about that. I'm just interested in how all of what you've spoken about fits in with the wider work with the stock condition survey that we have an ongoing program of maintenance and activity to bring properties up to standard. And I'm just wondering how that comes into play. I mean, if you can't give a detailed answer at this stage, perhaps you can respond to us, but I wonder if you can perhaps have a go at it for the moment, perhaps.
I would prefer to come back with a more detailed answer to that, if I may, Chairman. I would just say that as part of any stock condition survey going forward, I would expect to see improvements in a surveyor's specification, including the kind of thermal efficiency improvements and upgrades that are needed. But in addition, I would also be specifying any renewable power options that could be fitted within the envelope of the works that need to be done. But again, as I say, being relatively new into the post, I need to be talking to colleagues, meeting them, understanding what their specification is, what their plans are, and also making these things fully integrated into our strategy and our action plans, so that we're tying them back to some central strategic objective, and they fit in tandem with other things that we are doing. So I think a lot more will become clear as we develop the strategy for the climate action strategy and the various action plans and objectives that are dropping out of that. And hopefully I'll be able to return to you with the action plan and give you a clearer idea of how things like that may be integrated over the next 6 to 12 months.
Indeed. Thank you for that. Is there anyone else indicating before I sort of come to bring this to a
Chair, sorry, Councillor Gardner's waiting.
Sorry,
I
beg your pardon. I hadn't noted. I beg your pardon.
May I just interject there, Chairman? David, would it be possible to take down the presentation during the discussion?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Sorry. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that. Sorry, Councillor McConnell, did you indicate? I apologize, I missed that.
No, I was just going to say that Councillor Gardner has been waiting to ask a question.
Right. Okay, Councillor Gardner, my apologies. Please come in. Sorry.
Okay, bit of a waffle here. Because we've got limited social housing at the moment that doesn't meet the actual needs of our residents, how or what sort of incentive are we going to give into the private sector landlords who at the moment are we're putting tenants into their properties. The properties are substandard. They're making a fortune out of some of the rental charges, and I make no bones about that. It's common knowledge compared to the difference between the social housing rented and the private the private houses, private rented, and the state of the properties. What incentive are we going to give to those landlords to bring their properties up to standard?
Thank you, Councillor. Sorry.
Yes, please go ahead, David.
Yeah, I'd see that as there is a perennial problem with the private rented sector and asking or enforcing for landlords to make improvements. It's the difficulty has always been that landlords are not responsible for and this is in the energy context, not usually responsible for the energy bills. So they have very little interest in making, by and large, improvements to the specification of the building and ultimately bringing the costs down for the tenants. That was sort of my experience of it from quite a while ago. That it may well have changed, but where you're referring specifically to substandard properties, my approach to that would probably be to engage with my environmental health colleagues that are working in private sector housing standards and understand what enforcement options are available to us within that particular sector. Because if something is clearly substandard and the tenant is unhappy with the accommodation, then we have an enforcement route which we could potentially follow. I think there's a couple of issues bundled up in that question that would need unpacking and dealing with in a couple of different ways.
Okay.
Can I come back on that, if you don't mind?
You can indeed, Janet.
Yeah, it's just that we find that if residents complain about the private rented accommodation they're in, the landlord throws them out. So they end up back being our problem again, and then the landlord will relet to somebody else. And it's like it's an ongoing thing. I just wonder if there's any way. I mean, I've spoken to environmental health people in the private sector housing, and literally, and somebody complains about the state of the place, they're given their notice to quit. And I just wonder if there's a way that we can somehow incentivise the landlords to actually think about doing something for the tenants as opposed to making money themselves.
Yes, Councillor. I think we can do more in the area of communicating that a lot of these insulation incentives that are coming through are free of charge, and that we have we can signpost them to them. Quite how we encourage them more strongly, let's say, to improve the fabric of the buildings that they're renting, or improve the heating systems. I think that's a consultation piece, really. We need to try and understand what's making them tick, and what we could do to perhaps to get the game to be raised. I think it's a very, very difficult area. I worked in this from 2004, 2005, trying to encourage private sector landlords, and it was the most notoriously difficult area to advance. Even when the stuff was free, you couldn't give it away sometimes. And it's really trying to get into the mindset and understand what would make them change, I think.
I think if I could just come in on the back of that too, David, I suppose it's a bit of carrot and stick, really, isn't it? So it's about the incentive. It's also about the legislative framework behind evictions, no fault evictions, and about the sort of standards that are now coming forward in legislation for accommodation anyway. So it's easier said than done, Councillor Garden, and certainly you and I have been discussing this for more years than I care to think about. But I think there's some hope that we can draw upon there, certainly. I don't know if you want to come back on that, or if we can perhaps leave it there at that stage. Is anyone else indicating on that at all?
I am, yes.
Okay, go ahead, whoever that is. I'm sorry.
It's Tony Hillingdon again.
Oh, sorry.
Tony
Again,
yeah.
I beg your pardon.
I mean, it was just really a follow-up on Councillor Gardner's comments, because I understood that private sector landlords are required to ensure that the EPC rating is at least E or above now, and that even if it's an existing tenancy, if the property has F or G ratings, then they're breaking the law. And bearing in mind that we're trying to make the borough at least as good environmentally as possible, it seems to me that taking a proactive activities to seek out these landlords would be a good idea. I accept that EPC ratings are not particularly good because I think they're based on the total amount of energy used, and of course if it's a studio flat, inevitably it's going to be near the ABC level, whereas a large rambling property is going to be using a lot more energy. But nevertheless, it seems to me that there are opportunities for this council, if it really does intend to improve the environment and reduce carbon emissions, to take some sort of action. Thank you.
Okay, David, I don't know whether you have anything on that. I mean, I think if I can just come at this stage and just make one or two observations. I mean, there are a number of things that I think, David, you're going to kindly report back to us on. I've asked about the future home standards. We've asked about the stock condition surveys and how these various activities come into play. And there's been questions also around EPC. So I think if I can ask for that information to come to us, perhaps, and I think perhaps a more detailed report in due course when there's a little bit more meat on the bone. What I would say also, though, is that we will be consulting on the climate strategy in the near future. And of course, all of this will be out there for consultation anyway. So I think there'll be that opportunity to feed into it too. But I think this discussion has yielded some useful points for us to take away. But I think hopefully you've got enough there, David, to sort of respond to us to in the short term at least, and then with a view to perhaps having more information when you can give it to us in a report. Does that sound okay?
Yes, Chairman, no problem at all.
Okay, and I don't know if anyone else is indicating. On my phone, it just shows once you're indicating that it disappears. So if I miss anyone, I apologise, but just shout. I'm taking it there's no other indicator. So can I just wrap up this item by thanking David for his presentation and also colleagues for their comments. It's good to see you in the role, David. Certainly when we launched the climate strategy a year ago, one of the things was the appointment of someone in your role to sort of make this work for us across the council. And I think the fact it's so broad just demonstrates how it transcends the work of an individual POP. But we're all very, very, very much interested in this subject, and we wish you well in the role. So we look forward to having some information from in the short term about the things we've asked about. But I think perhaps a longer term report would be handy once at an appropriate juncture. So I think if no one else is indicating at that point, we'll leave it there. No one seems to be. So with everyone's agreement, we'll move on. So thank you very much. Let's move on to the next item. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Very much. And that takes us on to the next item, which is the next review topic, the next major review topic. Let's just introduce the report which is before us, because what we have here is a report which sets out the process by which we agree collectively at a decision on our next major review item. It reminds us of our direct remit, and it sets out some parameters to help us do that, as well as some selection criteria to help inform our decision making along the way. It also reminds us of what topics were not selected previously. And on page 14 of the report is a document I hadn't seen before, but it's actually a scorecard which can help inform decision making about those areas that we are considering looking at. So I'll just sort of highlight that for information at this stage. So really the purpose of this discussion, I suppose, is for us to raise any suggested topics for discussion among ourselves first. And then as with the autism recommendations, officers will take these away, road test them and do some scoping and report back for final decision making on our next topic review in March. So that's the plan. So that's what we've got in mind for that conversation. I think at this point it's appropriate though for me to make something public that will perhaps help inform our decision making already, and that is that in May of this year there will be some changes to the terms of reference of some of the policy and overview committees to better align them with some of the existing cabinet portfolios. So if I can just share with you the fact that what we will be looking at after May will be the portfolios involving families, education and well-being, as well as health and social care. And so that means that housing, which is one that currently sits with us, will move elsewhere from May onwards. So my point in just sharing that with you, and I think it's right to be open and honest that we're doing that, if we decide we want to look at a housing related theme, then it will have to be a relatively short piece of work, certainly before May, but certainly it's an option if people want to raise something. Now, just to get the ball rolling on this discussion, I have a suggestion that I want to run past everyone for consideration, and that is the issue of assistive technology. Call it telecare. I mean, telecare is one component of it, but assistive technology is a much broader area. I've long felt that this has been an area of great potential in terms of how we can help people live independently and live well. People with pendants and with relatives who can be contacted in cases of emergency, that's an absolute lifeline. It's an essential thing and it does a great job. But I think there's much, much more scope that we can build upon there. And I think a report that helps, or a piece of work that helps us understand that more fully and make recommendations potentially to Cabinet would be worth looking at as part of this. So, it speaks to health, it speaks to social care very much, as well as the whole integration agenda. So I'm going to float that now for any comment or questions. And if there are none, there are a couple of people with raised hands. Now, Councillor McQuarrie, I think you indicated first. Let me make a note of these because they only appear once on my phone. So I've got Councillor McQuarrie, I've got Councillor Gardner, and I've got Councillor Tuckwell. So if I could take Councillor McQuarrie first, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I was quite interested in our role as the corporate parents, and I would like to perhaps have some kind of review into overseeing council's corporate parenting responsibilities, especially with regards to early help prevention, or perhaps even to see how our children and young people have been during this pandemic. I'm also quite interested in adoption and fostering. And I think it's important to explore this area, especially as a council is part of a regional adoption agency as of 2019. So it'd be interesting to explore how that's been going on for us. So thank you.
Okay. I'm noting, we're all noting these as we go through. That's regional adoption agency. Can I come to, let me see, Councillor Gardner, you indicated?
I did indeed. As housing's going to disappear from this pot in May, can I suggest that we do a small review on HMOs, the enforcement of the HMOs, and how we identify them? Basically, so I'd like to get a little bit more information about them because they're springing up everywhere. Some are unregistered, some are registered, but I just like to, just have an officer's sort of like a small view of what we do. Okay.
Fine. I'll come back on all these if I may, Janet. I've noted that. So thanks for that. Now I've also got Councillor Tuckwell indicated.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. For me, and I'm not sure where this sits in the remit of the POC, but in respect of the provision of mental health services, particularly for young people, we all know that the impact of COVID for our younger residents has been considerable and significant. And I think a review that looks at raising the mental health awareness for young people and building resilience, particularly in the very young. Again, I'm conscious that a lot of the services that we use are run by the NHS, but that's my take, and obviously I'm keen to take any feedback. But I'd like to sort of see a review of mental health services, certainly if it's the main review, or certainly ones that we could take reports throughout the course of the year, because we do need to prepare for, you know, what the next generation are having to face with the pandemic and everything that goes with that. So that's my take this evening, Chairman.
Okay, that's helpful, Councillor Tuckwell. Now I've got Councillor Eggington next, I think.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the loss of housing helps us to focus on a lot of council expenditure, particularly on social care and children's social care. We haven't really, although I know that Councillor Magwana talked about corporate parenting. Of course, we do this on a regular basis within the committee anyway. So we've got annual, and perhaps we can concentrate on that within the panel. What I particularly think we might look at, well, one thing before I say any suggestions, could I suggest that perhaps we should try and decide on 2 topics now, because bearing in mind that May next year we will be having elections and there will be a significant change in the structure anyway of the council and the number of councillors as well. I'm sure that it would be better not to roll over any reviews after that date. So perhaps trying to arrange one short and one major review at this stage perhaps might make more sense. The ones which I particularly would be interested in relate to adult social care, particularly with regard to the effect of COVID-19 on the expected demand, related as well to long COVID. And somewhat linked to that is the healthy lifestyles. We really haven't looked at encouraging healthy lifestyles for some time. And clearly, people who were healthy had a better chance of coming through the pandemic than those who were less so. So I think trying to encourage for the council to try and encourage a healthy lifestyle for all of the communities of the borough would make sense. And then finally, I was thinking children's social care, and seeing how we are supporting those who are in greatest need. How, first of all, identifying and supporting children and families who are in greatest need. Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, fine. Is anyone else indicating? Not
Councillor Hagar.
Oh, Councillor Hagar. Yeah, Councillor Hagar, please.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to see actually adult social care, so the same as Councillor Eggington just suggested. I'd like to see where we are within that, especially through COVID and actually the services that we're providing currently. And I think that'd be a really good one to do a review on. Also, it's just go in line with that, but a public health service survey as well, and actually having to look into public health. There's been a lot of changes with COVID, and there probably will be a lot of changes going to the future. So I think it'd be something that would be really good educationally coming out to the public. So those are my 2 preferences. I'd also like to know a little bit more about what the health, I sound a bit naive here, but what the health control unit at Heathrow is. It's never something we've picked up at all, and I'm aware it is on here, but I didn't know whether anyone could explain that, whether any officer could explain what that actually is. Thank you.
Okay, right. Okay, well, should we put Steve on the spot with that one? Can you help us with that, Steve?
I was actually just going to come in on Councillor Eggington's point about raising 2 potential review topics. It's just that resourcing wise, 2 topics is perfectly fine, but running 2 reviews concurrently wouldn't necessarily be a possibility. So they'd have to be phased essentially to do one then the other. That was just to come in that. Unfortunately, Councillor Hagar, I'm not sure off the top of my head of the Heathrow Health Control Unit.
I believe it. I'll have a start. Stick my neck out. I believe it pertains to matters relating to food, hygiene, imports, that sort of controls around that kind of thing, as I understand it. But I'm prepared to be corrected. But perhaps we can have that information, Steve, if that's possible. Okay. Any other indicators? Because I'm going to suggest a way forward with this, because we've had no one seems to be indicating. So I'll sort of carry on. Okay. I mean, Steve, you've kind of anticipated what I was going to say. We can't bite off more than we can chew. Absolutely. We have a number of options. We could certainly do a smaller review first with a view to picking up something a little bit more meaty, sort of moving forward. That's certainly within our gift. What I was going to suggest, though, is perhaps an approach which says to officers, let's take away these items. Let's see what could be a runner potentially. It would be good to have perhaps a couple back that we could possibly go with here. And then possibly bring forward a smaller review at an earlier stage, and HMOs may well speak to that quite possibly. I think we've always got to road test these things. I think what we look at needs to work organisationally in terms of where we are with the development of services, what issues we've got. So I think we do have to road test these things. So Councillor Egginton, I am with you in terms of sort of picking a couple of things. I'm not sure we've got quite enough information to do that this evening, having said that. My suggestion is that if I give a quick summary of what I've got, we ask officers to road test some of these and then report back to us with a view to us deciding at our March meeting about a possible short-term review, and then something that's a little bit more long term. Does that make reasonable sense, do you think? I mean, don't feel you need to comment on that. If people are broadly happy with that approach, that's what I'm going to suggest. The other thing, of course, we can always do is just take a one-item thing at one meeting. And that's always within our gift. So it won't be a question of saying any of these are one thing is more important than the other. We can always look at these things in the context of our work programme. So let me just throw that into the equation first of all. If everyone's in agreement with what I've suggested and no one's indicating, let me just have a quick run through, make sure I've captured them all. So we spoke about my initial one, which was assistive technology and the opportunities associated with that and how we could possibly harness those to promote health and well-being among our elderly and vulnerable residents. We've spoken about corporate parenting and regional adoptions, and forgive me, I'm probably not doing justice to this fully. I'm hoping Steve's got this in more detail than I have. There was a suggestion of a small review in relation to HMOs and enforcement. So we've captured that one. That's something that we could have something back on. The suggestion was made, I think, by Councillor Tuckwell about mental health services in relation to children. I suppose what I would say about that is, because much on that side is commissioned by health partners and is necessarily within the remit of external services scrutiny, we would be confined to looking at the social care interventions and that sort of low-level preventative type thing. Nevertheless, I'm happy to forward it through to officers for comment, so to perhaps inform what we might do with that. And again, we could take that as an item at one of our meetings, but again, we don't need to decide that this evening. That's how I would suggest we look at that particular one. And then we went on to, and I'm struggling a bit here because the sound quality sort of deteriorated on my phone after that, but I did pick up that adult social care services, the effect of COVID on services, and I think potential future safeguarding measures for the pandemic and general health and lifestyle of our adult social care users. That's kind of what I took from Tony Egginton. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tony. I hope I've done justice to what you suggested there.
Well, there was one more, which was child social care and those in crisis need.
Okay, thank you for that. And then we came on to Councillor Hagar, and I'm afraid, Councillor Hagar, you'll have to help me out on this one if you wouldn't mind. It related to, let me see, again, it was COVID related. It related to public health and some of the challenges in the future. Could you kind of encapsulate that a little more succinctly than I just have, please?
Yeah, it was the same actually as Councillor Egginton. It was adult social care, that was one of them. And the other one was public health. No local authority public health service. So that was the two main ones for me. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. And and the point, I suppose, one point I would make is that, you know, some of these interrelate anyway. So we're not talking about a whole raft of things. You know, we can probably break it down to perhaps 4 or 5 if you look at it in detail. But can I just bring in Steve, our clerk, on this? I mean, Steve, what I'm suggesting is we take these away, get officers really to sort of road test and report back on them as a potential major topic, or perhaps smaller items that we could perhaps take at one meeting, or indeed a shorter review. Does that make sense to you, Steve?
Yeah, so scoping will be done, and you've got the scorecard as the appendix to this report.
Yes, indeed.
So that will essentially be filled out and populated with these ideas, scoping with officers in the relevant kind of departments, and that will be filled out for you. A couple of the items there noted, I'll probably bring this up in the work programme later in the meeting, but the item on HMOs, as you say, Chairman, as housing is maybe due to kind of leave the remit of this committee, it may be better for a one-off kind of report from officers in April, probably, or at least before May, and any changes to come back to the committee in a timely manner on that one.
Yeah.
And we can also have an information report on that Heathrow Health Control Unit to elaborate on that for us.
Okay, fine. And that may well be the way ahead in terms of HMOs, and it would give us time to have a look at that, as Councillor Gardner suggested, while it's still within our terms of reference. So that makes sense. So I've suggested the way forward. We've had Steve's comments on that. Any other comments, or can we agree to leave it as I suggested then? Okay, no one's indicating unless I'm much mistaken, so in which case we will move on. Thank you very much for that. That was a good discussion. Let's move on to the next item then, which is the forward plan, I think. Bear with me. Yeah. So onto the forward plan. Any comments on that from anyone? In which case, I will just, at the last meeting, I flagged the Public Health Integrated Services one as one that I'd be interested in looking at again. So that does now appear on our work programme. And as I say, when we come to the work programme, I think there are 1 or 2 things that we can add in the light of our discussion a moment or two ago. Any other comments on the forward plan at this stage from anyone?
Just briefly, if I may.
Yes, of course. I did see you indicating, Tony. Yes, yes.
No, that's all right. I quite understand a phone. You need a bigger phone.
The phone has its limitations, Tony, I'm afraid.
I think reference was made by David, perhaps, or somebody, about the cabinet meeting in March, and there being something to do with the energy efficiency. But there's nothing on the upcoming decisions which are circulated. Maybe it's been added soon.
I think Steve will help me out, but I think the answer to that is that this needs an update. But my information is that we will have a report to Cabinet in March, and that's the whole climate piece. That's the whole climate strategy, not just this. That will be just one component within it. Steve, am I right about that?
Yeah, so just to note that the forward plan in front of you, because of the quite short turnaround between our January meeting and our February meeting, it is still the previous month's forward plan, as the current one hadn't been published yet. So just to note that.
Chairman, I can interject here and just confirm that the climate action plan strategy will be presented to Cabinet in March.
Thank you, Dan. That's helpful to know. Does that help, Tony? Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, lovely. Okay, can we move on from the forward plan? Okay, thank you very much indeed. We come then to our last item, which is the work programme, and I would draw attention to the fact that we've got the public health integrated service contracts there. I mean, sometimes the issues that we decide we want to talk about, the dates may vary a little bit. It will be about timing and what information is available when, but we're working on September for that at the moment. Bearing in mind, you're talking about large contracts that are being brought together in a sense so that we can so that we can tender for those in due course in a way that better reflects our priorities. So that's why that's where it is. And of course, we've picked up the HMO one as a potential one, which could feature in our April meeting, but officers are going to report back on that. So that's something that Janet has suggested. Tony, you've raised your hand, I believe, on this.
Yes, I was just going to ask. I see that there's a line for looked after children performance data, but it doesn't seem to have been pushed. There's no date for it. And assuming it's not moved away from this committee, perhaps it should be in the next year. I can't remember the last time we had it here, but I would think it would be several months ago.
Yeah, yes. I mean, and it's certainly way before my time. I mean, that's a section that looks at items on a regular basis as part of a standard reporting process. Not sure when that was last there, but perhaps, Steve, you can either advise us or advise us outside the meeting on that.
Yeah, happy to look into that. That's part of the regular service monitoring, so it will be a cyclical item. So it's just a case of looking into when that will next be coming to the committee.
Okay. And I think in answer to your question, without wanting to preempt too much, Councillor Egginton, it's housing that's moving away rather than that particular component. So hopefully that will stay where it is. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, did you want to come back on that, Tony?
I just said hopefully it will be staying with us.
Well, it's not within my gift. I've shared what I did this evening because I thought it was worth doing, given that we were talking about the longer term with what we're looking at. That's all. But there we are. Okay. Is anyone else indicating on this? They appear not to be. In which case, we'll move on from that item, which brings our meeting to a close. And what I would ask everyone to do, apart from thanking councillors and officers for their participation, can I ask that we wait for Democratic Services to confirm the live stream has ended, please? Thank you very much.